as we go again, perhaps outside our comfort zone, to learn about one of the fastest growing plants on the planet and its potential for agriculture. So leading us in this journey this afternoon is Dr. Stan Pankratz. Dr. Pankratz joined as one of the co-founders of Summit View Development Corporation in 2010 to give a hand to some of the companies interested in accessing the federal Scientific Research and Experimental Development Program. So it was his assistance to a startup Algae cultivation company in 2011 that really led him on a personal journey focused initially on algae's potential to address Alberta and Canada's climate change challenge. And so his PhD studies culminated in a report to the provincial government highlighting the potential for algae to be cultivated for both fuels and chemicals. And since 2019, his research has shifted into the idea of cultivation of algae for protein to help meet the globe's ever-increasing need for nutritious food. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pankratz to introduce us to algae, perhaps the most recent addition to agricultural crops grown in Canada.
I want to thank Farming Smarter for the invitation to talk about perhaps a topic that you haven't given a lot of thought to, other than maybe to have spotted it. See if I get the buttons right. In some of your dugouts, some of your waterways, etc., and you're seeing it as, oh help, what are we going to do with this? And perhaps you've got some recreational areas that you've been familiar with where you've generally gone skiing or swimming, etc., and all of a sudden there's signs saying no more. There may be toxins in the water. These are all difficult subjects, and I'm not going to tackle them here. Perhaps you've been wondering about all of the algae in your sloughs where your cattle or your livestock are grazing nearby and also drinking the water, and wondering, are they going to be prone to picking up something they don't really need for their health? Anyway, my talk isn't about those things, rather it's looking at the glass half full. And so, first of all, the question you may have is there even a market for algae? I'm proposing to you that what's happening in the industry is that algae, it's not if it's arriving, it's coming up over the horizon. I've been bold enough to say, what you saw in the first slide, that the algae industry has the potential to eclipse the oil and gas industry as we've known it. That's a big, bold statement, and many of you might want to challenge me on that. Back in 2018, we saw some estimates in terms of the size of the algae market. The global market was looked at as being close to $700 million. And a couple of years later, they said, you know what, by 2028, this market is going to quadruple, and it's going to go to $2.8 billion. At about the same time, they said by 2026, a smaller niche subset of that, looking at strictly the Spirulina algae market, could be $2 billion just on its own. And then if you break that down even further, down to some of the bioactives that algae produce, like phycocyanin, my apologies, the market there is $2 billion by 2026. So I'm hoping that I've caught your attention, that there is some money in it for farmers of algae. How might a farmer get involved? Well, perhaps the first place you could start is working with a collaborator. Some of you may have already picked up sound bites from CBC or wherever over the last number of years where they talked about the discovery of a certain kind of algae, the Aspergillus taxiformis, that if you start feeding some of that, a small percentage of their feed, like about 5%, all of a sudden you can reduce the methane produced out of the rumen by over 80%. What they also found was when they fed it to dairy cattle, it actually bumped up their production of milk by over 30%. They also talk about the health of the animal. It stays much stronger, etc. When you're inseminating your cattle, they can become fertile much quicker. The take is much quicker. And in an interview that I saw with CBC, the fellow that had been feeding his cattle that sort of started this whole thing, he was waiting to hear from his veterinarian. And finally, his veterinarian came up to him and asked, "What's going on here?" And the farmer asked, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, the health of your feed, or of all of your cattle here, is much different than all of the other farms around the neighborhood." And he says, "What's going on? What are you doing to them?" And he says, "Well, you know what? Some of our grain that we were feeding, or some of our feed that we were feeding to our cattle, we couldn't access that anymore out of the States." This happened in Nova Scotia, I believe. And he says, "I remember my ancestors, what they did when they didn't have enough feed is after a storm surge out on the ocean, they'd go out and pick up all of the seaweed along, and they'd start feeding their cattle." So he thought, you know what, I'm going to try some of this. And lo and behold, he had started noticing things in his livestock herd, and ultimately he told that to the veterinarian, and that led to all sorts of studies around this. Anyway, you could collaborate with somebody that's producing this. This particular algae is a macro algae. It grows in the ocean, and so there's not very many places here where we're going to try and mimic that. But you could work with them. You could also cultivate a microalgae, and this happens to be the area of my own research with spirulina. Microalgae can double its biomass within 24, 48 hours. And there's not many crops that you're aware of that can do that. And you can harvest every day. And when you look at the composition of spirulina, 60 to 70% of it is protein, which is essentially double that of beef and chicken. So it's got, and beyond that, it's got all sorts of antioxidants, vitamins, carotenoids, etc. in it. And if you compare that with your wheat production, or your wheat composition, which is around 14% protein, I believe, and only about 40% of that, the plant is edible, whereas with spirulina, you can ingest the whole thing 100%. You've got something that captures, or may capture, your attention. Okay, so if you think that this may be a good idea, maybe you could build yourself a little bit of a raceway. And I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of raceway ponds where they're cultivating algae. Instead of looking at it as just scum, if you seeded it with spirulina, if your animals started drinking that water, etc., the health of your animals will likely improve, productivity may improve, and you may get to market quicker. Another place, you could also ask, what else can we do with the spirulina? And you can actually use it for protein and use it as an ingredient for cooking. And for those of you that have wandered around the room, there are some of those cookies with spirulina in them in the far corner. Another thing, but why did I choose cookies? Cookies happen to capture my attention because actually in Canada, it's a billion-dollar industry. And if you put it in as an ingredient into a cookie, you can go after a niche market like gluten-free or vegan, etc. And you can attract a higher margin. So that's another thing you can do with your spirulina. Another thing you can do is use it, either just harvest it as it is. It comes, you harvest it as a paste. And for those little jars that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, they're around $75. If you want the dry spirulina, it takes a lot of energy to dry it. You're going to pay more per kilogram. But you can also freeze it and then use it as you need it. Another market segment might be looking at energy bars, health food, etc. And so you can get, there's different approaches you can take to marketing what you're going to produce. However, something about spirulina, up to 20% of its biomass is actually something called phycocyanin, which attracts a different crowd. It's a food coloring, a natural food coloring. And on the open market, if you went onto Google, you'd probably find that you could pick up some of this phycocyanin for about $8 a kilo. However, if you purify it, you're going to get maybe $2,000 per kilogram. Not bad. Maybe some of you are interested in that. Now, how are you going to go about cultivating it? And so there's a few ideas. There's different ways that different people have looked at in terms of cultivating it. In the top left-hand corner are your raceway ponds. And you'll find many of those in New Mexico, out in Hawaii, in Australia, etc., where they've got hectares of land in raceway ponds. And they may be doing astaxanthin, they may be doing spirulina, etc. But does that work in Alberta? Maybe not so good. But some of the other technologies, which we call photobioreactor technologies, may work. Here's just another sample of some of the Canadian technologies that are available. People trying different kinds of photobioreactors, etc. But the question remains, if things are all that great, why hasn't algae gone mainstream? Many of you may have already followed the news over the last 20 years where there was this chase for using algae to produce biofuels. People like ExxonMobil have spent probably more than $1 billion chasing this to drive down the cost of production of algae so that they can get renewable biofuels, etc. So that's what that indicates to all of us is this is probably more nuanced than just getting the seed, getting some water, and dumping some fertilizer in, and we're good to go. Well, that is the truth. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey, as has already been indicated. I have focused over the last couple of years in terms of using algae to produce protein. And why protein? Because the population of our world is growing and is estimated that we're going to hit close to 9 billion people here by 2030. But there's something that captures my attention even more, and it's that even now, we've probably got 250 million people that aren't getting fed properly. How can we help them? And given that this plant grows so quickly, why can't we use algae to feed the world? So that's sort of my world. But if you compare the cost of producing a kilogram of algae, let's say spirulina, where I'm at and where I started at, it's probably a couple $100 per kilogram. That's not going to cut it because steaks are cheaper. So let's feed the world with steaks at $100 a kilogram. But how many of, if this was your problem to sell on your farm or to try and figure out, are you going to raise your livestock and cut the price in half? That would help, wouldn't it? But how many of us can do that? How about the crops that we're growing? Can you find a way to produce that same crop for half the price? If you were able to do that, you probably wouldn't be sitting here. You'd be sitting retired, probably. Anyway, I set out an objective for myself after my PhD and learning all the things that I did. I wanted to see if I could change this equation for algae. For algae, the literature was saying the reason you can't get to grow this, you need more photons of energy to get into the media. Because as you grow it, the density of that algae crop, which usually rides right on the surface of the water, as many of you have seen, can reach a couple 100 million cells per milliliter. So it's pea soup. How do you get photons in there to give the energy to the plants to grow? And yet, I thought, okay, if that's the limit, I'm saying, why can't we break through that barrier? And is that all that's there? And in fact, that became a driving force for me to conduct some research and investigate some other things. One of the things that I'd seen in the data while I was doing my PhD was that I was thinking about the algae cell, and it's producing O2. It's a plant, and it uses CO2. And so the faster you spin this thing, the higher the concentration of the O2 is going to be around the cell, and the more difficult it's going to be for the CO2 to get into the cell. I say, we got a mass gas transfer problem. How are we going to solve this? Okay, maybe you can mix up the water a little quicker so that it can transfer more of the gas out to at the surface, etc. But just doing that, is that going to do it? Well, what I stumbled across actually in reading was somebody published a paper on nanobubbles. And I thought, nanobubbles? What about nanobubbles? We know what microbubbles are. We know what big bubbles are. And we know that gas transfer takes place at the boundary layer between the bubble and the media around it. So a big bubble has a certain amount of surface area, but the smaller you put the bubbles, the more surface area you've got. So if you've got a microbubble, 10 to the minus 6, you've got a huge amount of surface area compared to one bubble. Now, take that down 3 orders of magnitude down to nanobubbles. That's not bad. Now, nanobubbles, though, nanobubbles, you may not have heard this word before, but that was discovered in around 1985. And for many years, people were contesting whether it actually existed. Because at the nanobubble state, you cannot see these bubbles. You can't find them under a microscope. How do you prove they exist? Because they're smaller than a wavelength of light. However, there are some technologies that do allow us to do that. And it's light scattering technology. It's called dynamic light scattering. And what we were able to find in our own studies was that our nanobubbles were in around the 120 to 180 nanometer scale. We're down there. We proved it. And part of the way that we proved it, the first way that I proved it, was taking pure water and shining a laser through it in the dark. Now, pure water, no bubbles. What's going to happen to your laser beam as you go through? You shouldn't be able to see much at all because it's pure. But as soon as you put nanobubbles in, you're going to diffract the light and you're going to see the path. So that was my first encounter with nanobubbles. And I said, oh, I got it. That's cool. Well, it turns out that you can actually create nanobubbles in several different ways. You can use electrolysis, and most of us know what electrolysis is. You can get oxygen out one side and hydrogen out the other side. But in between there are actually nanobubbles being generated. What we know about electrolysis, though, is that it's extremely energy intensive. It takes kilowatts of energy. You can also produce them by shoving air through very small porous material under pressure. But again, it takes a huge amount of energy. I'm trying to find a way not only to create these nanobubbles, I've got to keep my eye on the dollars because every electron costs some money. And in terms of a climate change impact, I've got to watch them as well because that's going to go against mitigating GHG emissions. Turns out, about 3-4 years ago, there was a group of scientists out in Ireland that discovered a new way to produce nanobubbles. And that was by applying an electric field. And I read that. That particular article was the one that captured and has changed my life in many ways because they were creating it with this electric field. I read through that. It had my attention, and I looked back. I need to contact these authors. And lo and behold, one of the authors was a University of Calgary professor where I live. I said, oh, I got to find this guy. And sure enough, and we've been collaborating. He gave me the clues. He's a theoretical chemist. So I said, can this really work? And he said, well, from a theoretical perspective, yes, and I can model that. And I says, well, how do I do that? I'm not an electronics whiz kid. He says, well, it's not really that difficult. Why don't you try it? Anyway, so we did. We constructed it. We got it. And we went forward. Now, when I added that to my media, all of a sudden, I noticed that an uptick in the production of my algae went by about 30%. And I go, whoa, how did I do that? And it turns out we've got a couple of patent applications around that. But it actually gets even more interesting than that because these nanobubbles aren't just about algae. They touch agriculture. Anybody that's involved in vertical farming, you've got your nutrient media in a solution and you've got your roots in the media. But your roots all need a certain amount of oxygen. And how do you get more oxygen to it? Well, there's something about nanobubbles that's very interesting. At the size that they are what we call metastable. That means they have neutral buoyancy. They don't go up, they don't go down very much. They just stay there in solution. That means instead of, if you've got an aquarium and you're bubbling air, sparging air from the bottom, you want the smallest bubbles possible because that gets more oxygen in for the fish. And so the smaller you go, But with nanobubbles, once you've put them in there, they stay. So in other words, instead of sparging air with microbubbles, if you've got nanobubbles in there, as long as you keep circulating the water's going to come to the surface, and those bubbles are going to be there. You're going to get much quicker mass gas transfer taking place. And this makes lots of good sense when you're a fisherman. Where do you go fishing? Where are your favorite spots? On a lake or on a river? And is it out at the outlet of the river, or if you're in the mountains, after the water is cascaded down, is that where you're going to go finding your fish? Most fishermen would say, bingo, you got it. Why is that? Well, number one, the water tends to be colder coming out of the stream, which means it has more ability to accept the oxygen. Plus, it's been dumping over all of these rocks and collecting more oxygen. It's super saturated. Now, if I was a fish and I was having trouble breathing, I would head over to where there's lots of oxygen. That makes good sense to hang out there all day, unless I'm hungry and I need to go find it. Well, that's why you throw your lure in there, because they're going to be looking for something else to eat. Anyway, I digress a little bit further, but let me talk to you just a little bit further about how would we apply nanobubbles in the life of farming. Could we put nanobubbles into a water trough so the algae grows better, and maybe seed our water trough instead of having the goop that's sitting in there? Maybe pick something like spirulina that actually has really good nutritional value. What about irrigation? Your roots still need oxygen. If you put nanobubbles in, my hypothesis is, and I haven't tested this out, but I'd sure like to, is to inject these nanobubbles into an irrigation system and do a comparison between what does this crop look like versus this one, this neighboring crop. I'd love to test that out because I believe your delivery of your nutrients is going to increase. And your roots are going to be happier because you're not going to overwater as easily as you do with irrigation. Something else about these nanobubbles has caught my attention because many of you are familiar with water remediation. And many of you know that they use aeration as part of finishing up your municipal waste. And so they bubble in a whole bunch of air into it so that the microbes get their oxygen. It turns out they use anywhere close to 50 to 70% of the energy that goes into water remediation goes into aeration. And it's bubbling, and those bubbles just tend to rise and go out. But remember, the nanobubbles stick around. So all you would have to do is cycle that water. Did you know that the amount of energy that wastewater treatment takes is around 5% of North America's electrons? That's a big number. So if we could change that equation by making it possible to reduce the amount of aeration that's required by injecting nanobubbles, maybe we could achieve 20%. You multiply that out times all of the electrons that are being produced right now, maybe we could take down gigatons of GHG emissions. And so nanobubbles actually, if you're looking at economics, that's probably where more of the money is than even the algae. Anyway, that's my take on it. I'm going to just close off with this. I've introduced algae, I've introduced spirulina, and I've introduced nanobubbles. And I don't know where it exactly intersects with your world, but if you're interested, I love conversations around these topics, and probably talk more than you would like, but if interested, I would welcome continuing the conversation, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Well, that's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? Very, very interesting concept. So surely with all the great scientific minds we have out in the audience, we've got a few questions about nanobubbles or algae. Anyone? Okay, right at the back. Go ahead.
What's the smallest scale that you are looking at?
Right now, we're still just working off of bench scale. My research and where I've achieved actually doubling the density and yield of my spirulina crop. I'm very pleased for that. I'm hoping to push that boundary even further, but it's on bench scale. And the same would be with the nanobubbles, although the technology is relatively simple and lends itself to ease of integration, plus also scaling. We believe it. Right now, we've got a batch type of nanobubble generator, and we've got a flow-through concept. So we've got both of those, and I'd love to try. So, but it's still very rudimentary.
Mike?
Yeah, with the algae production for protein and meat and things like that, is there any concern about toxins like protozoa, bacteria, harmful things that grow within that medium? Or is it like sort of purification process, or is it just like, how does that work?
I love your question. The question is are there all sorts of other bad things in the media that we're growing? And we try to grow as close to an anexic population as possible. However, that's almost impossible. But if your concentration of your spirulina, that's what I'm referring to now, it could be chlorella, there's only a handful of different algae that Health Canada permits into the food chain right now. And if you go with pure algae, the eukaryote algae, there are no known toxins that I've come across in the literature if you're eating any kind of algae. It's only when you cross over into that cyanobacteria side that on the bacteria side there are some species of cyanobacteria that have toxins. That's a whole nother nuanced topic.
Okay. So does this mean you're growing spirulina like in your basement, or you've got a facility? Where are you growing it?
Thank you. I took my postdoctoral position in 2020, just as COVID hit. At the university, they shut down the labs. So I did it at home, in my basement, and it's migrated out to the garage. And so if any of you are interested, that's where you will find me and my friends.
Your fast-growing friends, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so I guess what's your next step? I mean, you're looking for ways to sort of get it out into test atmospheres, and if things start to open up a little more, where do you see pursuing the next logical step in developing this?
Wow, thank you for the question. You've heard where I'm going or where I want to go. I would like to get the production of protein down to $20 per kilogram, which puts us right in competition with many other forms of protein. And once we're there, I think we're in a much better place to start feeding the people on the margins. Way, way better. And I've set out an objective for myself to get there within 5 years. Now what I'm finding is that my own pocket isn't quite deep enough to take me there. So, do I need to continue?
You need partners, yes. Okay, well, there you go. Yeah, any other questions at all? I think everyone's just kind of pondering this idea, but now I noticed, I think you still have a booth in the corner here. So if you want to taste, you've got some cookies left?
There's cookies.
There's
there.
cookies. If you want to taste some cookies and talk further about algae, so it's not like the stuff that comes on the pond scum. It's totally.
I want to see the glass half full.
Okay. It's hard to change that image if you've ever bluestoned a dugout. Yeah.
Let me speak to that one.
Okay.
There's something about the nanobubbles that if you sparge, there's some new technologies out by Algae, the people that make the fridges and stuff like that, and they're pushing this technology. It's actually a sonication at a specific frequency that knocks out a lot of algae. So you can take care of it on your ponds. It's expensive. I'm sure. I actually haven't looked at it. However, what I'm asking in my head is, what are they really doing? And has algae considered that maybe with their sonication, they're in fact creating nanobubbles because you can't see them. How do you prove it? Again, I've got some tools I can work with, but I believe, and I've wanted, my daughter's parents have got a ranch, and they have always got goop. And I've said, you know what, we just need to create one of these nanobubble generators and stick it in your pond and see what happens. Because if you get enough air circulation of these bubbles, you're not going to have a problem. That's my hypothesis. I need to prove it. So if somebody wants to try, we can look at that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Stan, for sort of expanding our mind on this. We have a small token of our appreciation, and yeah, maybe you can stir some nanobubbles with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And he's over in the corner if you want to talk to him more about that. You know, it's a great way to end the program because that's what Farming Smarter is all about, is taking research and challenging us and you know, making us think about old things in new ways. And so we are very grateful for you for being open to new ideas and coming and taking in Farming Smarter. How about a big round for Ken? And poor Jamie couldn't be here with us, but she did all the hard work in organizing it. And Ken's got a great team. Let's have a big round of applause for Ken and the Farming Smarter team.